1, The Whispering Woods. I grew up in a rural town surrounded by dense forests. The woods were our playground during the day, but at night they transformed into a realm of shadows and whispers. Local lore spoke of the Whispering Woods, a part of the forest where people heard voices calling their names and saw figures darting among the trees. One summer, my friend Jason and I decided to camp out in the woods, close to the area known for its eerie reputation. We were both 17, seeking thrills and eager to debunk the legends. We set up our tent just before dusk, the fading light casting long, ominous shadows. As darkness fell, the forest became eerily silent. The usual sounds of crickets and nocturnal creatures were absent, replaced by an oppressive, almost tangible stillness. We built a small fire and tried to shake off the unease that had settled over us. Around midnight, we heard it, a faint whispering just beyond the reach of the firelight. At first, we dismissed it as the wind, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were calling our names. Jason, Lucas. We exchanged nervous glances, trying to appear brave. Jason suggested we investigate, convinced it was someone playing a prank. Armed with flashlights, we ventured into the trees, the light from the fire quickly fading behind us. The whispers continued, leading us deeper into the woods. The voices seemed to come from all directions, disorienting us. We called out, hoping for a response, but the only answer was the rustling of leaves and the whispering voices. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered and went out. In the darkness, I heard Jason gasp. When I turned to look, he was gone. Panic surged through me as I called his name, my voice echoing through the trees. Then a hand grasped my shoulder. I spun around, expecting to see Jason, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, surrounding me in a cacophony of voices. I ran, stumbling through the underbrush, desperate to find my way back to the campsite. When I finally broke through the trees into the clearing, Jason was there, pale and shaking. He claimed he had seen figures moving in the shadows, watching us with glowing eyes. We packed up our things and left, the whispers following us until we reached the edge of the forest. We never spoke of that night again, but the memory lingers, a reminder of the whispering woods and the voices that call out in the dark. Story 2, The Haunted Doll. My grandmother was an avid collector of antiques, her house filled with curiosities from different eras. Among her collection was an old porcelain doll dressed in a faded blue dress with a cracked, lifelike face. She kept it in a glass case in the guest bedroom, where I often stayed during summer visits. As a child, the doll unnerved me. Its glassy eyes seemed to follow me wherever I went, and I always felt a cold draft in the room, even in the height of summer. My grandmother brushed off my concerns, insisting it was just an old doll. One night, during a particularly violent thunderstorm, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the occasional flash of lightning. Unable to sleep, I lay in bed, watching the shadows dance on the walls. Then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. It was a faint tapping, like tiny fingers drumming on glass. I sat up, my eyes adjusting to the dim light, and saw the silhouette of the doll in its case. The tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent. Gathering my courage, I crept out of bed and approached the glass case. The doll's eyes seemed to glow in the darkness, and I could swear I saw its tiny hand moving, tapping on the glass. I reached out to touch the case, but the moment my fingers made contact, the tapping stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Suddenly, the glass case shattered, the sound echoing through the house. The doll fell to the floor, its porcelain face cracking further. I screamed, and my grandmother rushed into the room, finding me standing over the broken doll. She cleaned up the mess and put the doll away, but the incident left me shaken. That night, I dreamed of the doll, its eyes following me, its cracked face twisting into a sinister smile. When I awoke, the room was cold, and the doll was back in its case, untouched. My grandmother passed away a few years later, and the doll was sold along with the rest of her collection. I never saw it again, but sometimes in the dead of night, I hear the faint tapping of tiny fingers and remember the haunted doll that watched me with lifeless eyes. Story 3, The Vanishing Hitchhiker. During my college years, I often drove home late at night along a lonely stretch of highway. The road was long and desolate, cutting through miles of dense forest. It was on one of these late-night drives that I encountered the vanishing hitchhiker. It was a cold, rainy night, the kind that made the world outside the car feel like a different realm. The rain pounded against the windshield, and visibility was poor. As I rounded a bend, I saw her, a young woman standing by the side of the road, drenched and shivering, her thumb extended in a desperate plea for a ride. I hesitated, the stories of hitchhikers and urban legends flashing through my mind, but compassion won out. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Do you need a ride?" I asked. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear and gratitude. She climbed into the passenger seat, water dripping from her clothes onto the upholstery. She gave me an address a few miles down the road, and I set off, the car's heater struggling to combat the chill she brought with her. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. Eventually, I tried to make conversation. "Where were you headed in this weather?" I asked. She looked at me with sad eyes and said, "Home." Her voice was soft, almost ethereal, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced at her, noticing how pale she was, her skin almost translucent in the dim light of the dashboard. As we neared the address she had given me, she spoke again. "Please be careful," she said. "This road is dangerous." I nodded, my unease growing. When we reached the address, I turned to tell her we had arrived. But the seat was empty. The passenger door was closed, and there was no sign of the girl. Confused and shaken, I got out of the car and looked around. I was in front of an old, decrepit house, its windows dark and boarded up. As I approached the house, the door creaked open, and an elderly woman stepped out. "Can I help you?" she asked, her eyes filled with sorrow. I explained what had happened, describing the girl and the address she had given me. The woman's face grew pale, and tears welled up in her eyes. "That was my daughter," she said, her voice trembling. "She died in a car accident on this road 10 years ago. People sometimes see her, trying to get home." I felt a cold dread settle over me as I realized I had given a ride to a ghost. The old woman thanked me and closed the door, leaving me alone in the rain. I drove away, my mind racing with the implications of what had happened. The vanishing hitchhiker was no longer just a story. It was real. To this day, I can't drive that stretch of highway without feeling her presence, a reminder of the young woman who never made it home.